All right, so welcome to a deeper dig of the Small Farms Winter Webinar Series. These bonus episodes are meant to continue each week's webinar topic in conversation with members of the Local Foods and Small Farms team and that week's presenter. In this informal chat, we'll talk about the week's topic, maybe answer some of those lingering questions that we didn't get around to in the chat box, and hear more from our speaker. I'm Grant McCarty. I'm a local food and small farms educator for Joe Davis, Stevenson, and Winnebago counties. I'm joined by Bronwyn Ailey, a local food and small farms educator for Gallatin, Hamilton, Hardin, Hope, Saline, and White counties. Did I do that right, Bronwyn? Did I cover them all?
You did. I think you got them all.
Good. Glad you're
better than he does sometimes.
Oh, right. We're also joined by Katie Bell, local foods and small farms educator for Franklin, Jackson, Perry, Randolph, and Williamson counties. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
How's it going there?
Doing good. I I have trouble with my counties too. I usually list them off on my fingers, and that's what I was doing whenever you were saying. I'm like, okay, you got them all.
And finally, we're joined by Nathan Johanning. He's a commercial agriculture educator from Madison, Monroe, and St. Clair counties, and he was our presenter on vining through pumpkin production. So welcome, Nathan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you were out of pumpkin production, well, at least the webinar for the last 2 weeks. How are you feeling with how it went, and where's your mind at this point?
Oh, my mind's all over the place. That's pretty well typical, but no, we've no, lots of good, I heard from some of you that had listened to the webinar and, had some more specific questions, and certainly, people are always welcome to reach out, and send an email, and we can answer more. But no, lots of questions on, things that were variety selection, other different production techniques. I actually had a large grower from our area that called. I spent a half an hour talking about, variety selection for some specific, sizes and shapes of jack-o'-lanterns and things, what would be some best performance items, especially in our area. So no, this has always been all over the place as far as, different topics, but always lots of pumpkin information to share. So.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I take away from it. And I don't know if you and Katie, Bronwyn and Katie feel this way too, but you think to yourself, oh, I just know this 3 or 4 pumpkin varieties. And then you start listening to Nathan's presentation and you realize you've barely grown any in your entire life. Katie and Bronwyn, what's your experience been with pumpkin production and growing pumpkins?
You want to go first, Bronwyn?
Yeah, so it has been a while since I've done much work with any research on pumpkin production. We did some way back in the day at Dixon Springs. We did a little bit of work comparing pumpkins grown on plasticulture versus bare ground. And I think one of the other treatments also included a cover crop that we turned under, not looking at like following wheat, that I think Nathan utilizes a lot in his no-till production. But that was some time ago with one of our past campus specialists looking at more on weed management. Was one of the last projects that we did. But in helping Nathan over the last few years at Pumpkin Field Day, I am always amazed at the number of varieties that are put out and demonstrated for that event each year or every other year. It is amazing, and it also is very funny to me. I don't know, 75 or 100 varieties or more, and Nathan can tell you about each of them and what category they fall in, and whether they have a good handle or they the size of them, how they compare to each other. Their different uses anyway. He's kind of the walking variety encyclopedia is kind of what I think. So.
Right. And I say a lot of that it's just experience, when you do it, when you walk after you've picked up so many hundreds, if not thousands of pumpkins and seen these varieties. It's just something that, the experience just kind of lends itself to, I guess. But no, it's, it definitely comes in handy when the phone rings, to have some of that knowledge offhand. But I will not lie. I know a few things offhand. Certainly, I have a copy of like Variety Trout reports not far away that usually come out to give specifics and things that I may not remember offhand. So, but yeah, I think that's one of the things that I enjoy with doing. I think you would echo this, Bronwyn, and Katie, and everyone, just physically doing the research. When it's something you do yourself, it's a lot easier just to remember it and share it than if it's, oh, let me, look up a fact sheet that, even if it's something you've done, I don't know it, it's winter greens production or whatever may be, as well as if I had physically done it. So that's why I like to do as many things as I can, and probably usually a few more than that. So
I think that's the fun part of our job, is when we do have the opportunity to do hands-on research, and
especially as
that's the part that you enjoy, the production side, and then you do become a lot more familiar with the crop that you're working with, and whether it's variety work or fertility work. And
yeah, I will say, even though I have helped over the last, for some background, I guess I was Nathan's intern and then Bronwyn's intern before I became an educator myself. And working with Nathan on a couple different pumpkin field days, even though I had helped quite a bit and I was there for the planting and the layout and harvest and things, until I had done it myself this past year, there were parts of it that I didn't like quite compute until you had to do it yourself, or you're scouting, and whenever an insect threshold, for example, you're like, oh, there's not that many, and then you go back and you're like, well, I should have sprayed last week. And, and just kind of fine tuning those things. So that's, I think, really the fun part of our job when we get to do the hands-on work.
Yeah, even if it's not, say it's a pumpkin variety trial, but you're scouting insects, you're also, for me, it helps me understand when a grower calls and they're trying to figure out how to handle insects. You're like, it's one thing to read what a manual says, but then it gives you a lot better handle on saying, well, here's how you need to scout it, or give you some confidence, say, you're all right, or yes, you need to spray, or just, hold off another week, or, something like that. So,
hey, Nathan, you're talking about the insect stuff. It's making me think. I have always had a challenge with the squash vine borer. And, we can read, I can look in we can look in our production handbook spray guide, but what has been your experience with the best way to control the vine borer?
So on a larger scale, often I haven't had huge issues with vine borers. You can, and I think in the spray guides, I watched them, and I think I haven't checked all of them. I may lose maybe a couple of plants, a handful out of a couple acres, but nothing substantial to the level that is warranted. I think on a small scale home garden, I think it's a lot worse. Certainly, monitoring and spraying, and the organic side, there's Dr. Athey, our entomologist, has been a big proponent of exclusion netting for insects. I think something like that would work in those first couple of weeks, especially on a small scale, for pumpkin production. Otherwise, doing some scouting or just an early season directed, spray, especially, it's those first few weeks as those are really getting up where that's most problematic. Now, zucchini squash is a completely different story. I swear that is like vine borers, kind of magnet, but they can affect pumpkins. But the on a field scale, it doesn't seem like they're as problematic. And I don't know if it's kind of safety in numbers. There's enough plants out there that they can take one or two and it doesn't matter. Whereas when you have only 3 plants and 1 or 2 are gone, well, then that's all of a sudden you have 2/3 of a crop failure. So, but anyhow, that's been my experience. It's something to watch for, and certainly can be problematic, but not as problematic as some of our other pests later in the season.
Yeah, like from a northern perspective, I have seen kind of anecdotally that starting pumpkins indoors and then getting them out as a transplant seems to help a little bit to kind of get over that window of that squash vine borer population. It's not perfect, but I think it does kind of allow for you to be able to at least have it growing rather, and then provide protection for a bit of time. And then hopefully we'll get there too.
Sure.
Yeah, we did something similar with our zucchini squash, and we had some patty pan squash this summer, and we planted some out earlier, and the patty pans got wiped out, and then but we had some transplants left over, and we put them out later in the season, and those made it. So we kind of missed the window.
Yeah, you've almost got like a trapped crop in a way, and that like your sacrifice is thrown out there.
Yeah, they are. Once you have them or get very many, they're a difficult thing to control, because if you're not really actively scouting, once you see it and notice some plants wilting, it's too late. You can't, there's little you can do on a large scale, to remedy that. So that's, so if it's been, my always thought is on that, if it's been a problem in the past, expect it could be a problem in the future. If you haven't had a problem, then be vigilant, but certainly that's always, scouting in that can be very localized, even down to what, your specific, garden field setting and, the pest pressure from previous crop history or what's around you. So yeah, just being aware of that is really important.
Have you seen, Nathan, like any varieties of pumpkins that they, like in your research, have you done any that kind of look at varieties that are more prone to insect pressure, to insect, like they like one more than the other? I know you sometimes see that occasionally with like cucumber beetles, I believe, but I didn't know, especially with some of your pumpkin varieties, if that's been noticeable.
So the biggest thing that I've seen, I do see some varietal differences from time to time. It can be highly variable. One thing that does always stand out is with some of our specialty pumpkins, cucumber beetles especially love a lot of we call the Cucurbita maxima family. So that's like all of your winter squash family, your blue Gerardales, your the 1-2-manys, and any of those Cinderella, all those types. For whatever reason, the maxima family is, I don't know if it's quote sweeter to them or just more favorable, but they love those and they will flock to those. I think even there was I've heard of places like a Blue Hubbard is another one that kind of falls in that. I've heard of people in organic systems even using that as a trap crop for cucumber beetles because they are so highly attractive. And I will drive through a field, oftentimes maybe it's when we're making a fungicide or some other spray, and you'll hit some of those rows, and I've seen cucumber beetles just swarming out of those. You'll notice one or two here and there, but you'll just, I've had them hit.
That's a nightmare.
Fortunately, cucumber beetles, on pumpkins late in the season, you can tolerate, and this is when they're all vined out and kind of mature. If this is when they were young, then that's really problematic. But you can tolerate a decent amount of cucumber beetles, and see them. So just because you see one or two or see some, it's not the end of the world. And some points they're never down to 100% controlled, and that's all right. You can handle having a few and still, still get away with that. But it's, that is one like pest interaction that I definitely see with varieties is all those winter squash type family are very, very, very much attract your cucumber beetles and other, related beetle species like that. Some of our corn rootworm beetles that also feed on pumpkins. But beyond that, disease wise and things is kind of a separate. I've seen some things once in a while on diseases, some favor. Certainly we have some powdery mildew resistance in some of our varieties. So that's helpful. And remember with those, I think I mentioned that it's not all out resistance. It's just they tolerate it better. They'll get it. but they won't get it as quickly and it won't spread and be as devastating as it would be on a non-resistant variety. But, overall, there's always nuances and things that, maybe aren't documented, but you'll just see that it seems like this pest always goes to certain variety first or whatever it may be. So
I think that's one thing for me being kind of new to pumpkin production is what is like when you're scouting or looking, what is an acceptable amount of leaf discoloration or die off? Because older leaves do die off, but when what are some things that people could look for to know, oh, this is just normal, or I've got a disease issue that I need to nip in the bud?
So it's really common to see, we see like the yellow leaves and pumpkins later in the season. It's often very easily mistaken for downy mildew, or people think they have downy mildew because they see older leaves that turn yellow. So, and there's some good articles. I know a colleague of mine, Danny Eagle from Purdue, had a really good article last year about yellow leaves and pumpkins, and it's a little bit of some of a nebulous topic. A lot of it that from what I've read, tends to go back to plant nutrition. You'll see those older leaves, and they're usually always the oldest ones. And kind of how you can tell it even from a glance is you'll often see that leaf yellowing following the pumpkin rose. So the leaves that first form near the base of the plant, you'll see it almost down the middle of the rows. You'll see these kind of yellow leaves. Some of the tallest leaves will start to turn yellow. If I see that and it's in a very patterned row, kind of road environment, that's not a disease. That's more than likely something nutrient related. It can be nitrogen just due to how nitrogen is mobile in the plant. So the plant's really growing rapidly and it's robbing nitrogen from those older leaves. Just because you see it doesn't necessarily even mean it can also, I think, just be a natural part of that plant's progression. And that leaf is, basically done its useful life. And so you're trying to, it's, basically cutting that leaf out. Maybe that leaf is more of a sink for nutrients than it is, or photosynthate than what it is promote and providing things. So, certainly making sure you have a plan for fertility and kind of being proactive. That's where I think I mentioned in the webinar, you're trying to split applications so you can kind of tailor that, make sure you're providing fertility. Potassium is another one besides nitrogen that we sometimes can see subtle issues just because pumpkins are extremely high potassium feeders. And with any of this, weather can also play in the role. If it's really, especially for potassium and also nitrogen or any of the nutrients, when it's really dry, the plants need that water to take up with the nutrients. So when it's dry, you can see some stress that kind of manifests itself in times as nutrient deficiencies in subtle ways, because water is a part of needing to get those nutrients into the plant, even if the nutrients are physically present in the soil. So that's just, and some of those things we can't control, right? But certainly keeping those pumpkins on ahead of the curve when it comes to fertility, early in the season. Don't wait until they're stressed to fertilize them. Trying to have a plan in place from your crop history and stuff that kind of you're putting the fertility out there in whatever form you'll use in your system to make sure that you're keeping that plant growing, especially early in its life, and not struggling or having some subtle stress on it, and it's growing as best as it possibly can for that growing season.
So one of the one of the questions that was in the chat box was organic production, and we talked a little bit about that already today, about trap cropping and being mindful of insects and disease pressure. I've got some ideas, but I wanted to kind of hear what your ideas were if you were going to incorporate organic production or even pursue organic production.
So I think certainly any organic production system has some pest challenges, and pumpkins especially, I think it gets even worse as you head further south with more kind of heat and humidity. Things like powdery mildew are more problematic. There are some OMRI approved fungicides and things I know even our plant pathologist has started to use. And I think there's again, any of those are extremely protectant in nature. So keeping that in mind is that you really, you know, if you're going to use any of those, they're not reactive. So they need to be out there before you see any issues. But I mean, we've hit on a couple of these concepts. I think the organic production can be managed. You know, some of our downfalls, if we do get an explosion of insects, especially squash bugs or you know, a bad infestation of disease, you know, my experience, which is somewhat limited, but I feel like then our options get a little limited as to what we can do. But could we use some of our powdery mildew resistant varieties as a good start? That's where I would look to. Some of our specialty pumpkins, like our winter squashes and things, don't tend to get powdery mildew as bad as some of the traditional orange jack-o'-lanterns do. So that's one thing. So I think if you're able to manage the fertility and have a healthy plant, I think you can maybe not overcome, but you can grow a decent crop. And then maybe the diseases may come in late in the season, depending on you can get a crop out. Another thing is trying to, with a little experience, try to not plant too early. When I've seen like a healthy pumpkin field, you know, like any of us as humans, those plants seem to be really healthy when they're young, but you get more disease issues and you get more, you know, issues in those plants as you age or as they age. So if you have a crop that was planted super early and it's mature and it hits August, whenever you have that window of powdery mildew and stuff hitting, you know, I feel like it succumbs really quick to that, compared with maybe a mid to late June planting that's I guess a little more useful. It's just there's more vigor in that plant, and it's able to kind of thrive through that and kind of still produce a decent crop before you get an overtaking of, you know, some of those potential diseases. And for us, at least, I don't know how bad it is up your way. Down here, powdery mildew is almost an annual. You're going to have powdery mildew in some capacity at some point in the season.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think it hits about mid-August. That's
yeah.
And so at that point, depending on how far along the pumpkins are, it may not be justified to kind of do any application. Just kind of based on, you might be taking them out of the field in the next couple of weeks with that. But yeah, I mean, you bring up some really good points. I think especially if you're looking at organic production, it would be a lot of insect and disease issues that you'd want to really focus in on. You know, when I think about organic production, I think, and this gets to your point, Nathan, and probably what some of us have also experienced, is that you've got to have your market, right? Like, you know, carving pumpkin, organic certified production is probably not needed. Maybe it's the specialty pumpkins where they're going to be edibles, where maybe you could have, if there was a processing or anything like that, I think you could be like, well, maybe we should move it into an organic production system. I think that would kind of be the only place I really see it. What do you think, Bronwyn? What do you think, Katie?
I think, yeah, if you're trying to find a little bit of an edge in your market, especially if you're like a farmer's market type setup, or even just like a smaller order, if you had that little bit of an edge on your market to say these processing pumpkins are organic, because that's really, I think, where we would care about it, because the orange jack-o'-lanterns, you know, you're not eating them or anything, but we are very concerned about what we're eating or what people are feeding to their families. So using that would give you maybe a little bit of a boost marketing wise. Now, whether it would be justified for your production purposes, the little bit of a premium that you could get for being organic, you'd have to make sure that your market's there. So I would always, you know, with anything, start small. I think would be my recommendation, to make sure, test the market, make sure it's there.
And then that makes me, I guess, come back to you, Nathan, with another question as we think about the varieties and those that do have some powdery mildew resistance. Do we see some of those resistances in these specialty or more edible type pumpkins than or are you seeing that the breeding putting those resistances more in the jack-o'-lantern
So
pumpkins?
I think most of it is in the jack-o'-lantern and in that family of cucurbits. So some of the other families, and I haven't read this, just my field observation is that it seems like our jack-o'-lantern types and those in that cucurbita pepo family are the ones, it seems like they're the first ones to get powdery mildew. I think any of them will get it. It feels like they are the ones that are like the variety where that really powdery mildew really hones in on first. One thing that I thought of in this discussion, as you mentioned, is that with the powdery mildew, is it affects the defoliates the fruits. That causes a couple of concerns that you want to consider, especially if you're approaching organic production, is when you have all those pumpkins under leaf cover and then all of a sudden they come out of leaf cover into the sun. Some varieties worse than others, but you can get really bad issues with sun scald or sunburn because those, especially if you get a period where it's 90 degrees in September, kind of like the last one, and it's really sunny, they open up. And I've heard a lot of issues with, sunburn, sun scald issues in that because they weren't used to being out in the sun. And then you all of a sudden throw them out there and you get some intense sun. So that's one thing. The other thing is powdery mildew can really influence not just the foliage, but also the stems. We love the handles and stems, but if you get to the point, there's fruit out there, but you can start to see those white lesions on the stem. That's what causes, if you've seen pumpkins that have that stem that just kind of curls up like a little string, like it looks great when you pick it. And then about a week later, you go back and it's about the size of your pinky or a pencil. That's what powdery mildew infections is what causes that. So, and at that point, whether it has a stem or it's one of those, small kind of shrunken, stems from the powdery mildew, to me, that really reduces the marketability and the look of that fruit. So that's some things to consider. Now, would that mean that maybe you're trying to, if you do see disease come in, you try to harvest and pull those fruit out versus leaving them out in the field, say, especially in an organic situation where you're not managing? Maybe that's a cultural technique you could help, but certainly leaving them out in the field, you can get that, and that can be a big challenge. Especially, I don't think it's maybe as bad if you are, or as important if you're doing a U-pick, just because the consumer at least picks it and sees it's good. But certainly if you're pre-picking them or marketing them, you're going to have a lot of challenges if you have a lot of pumpkins with, those kind of malformed stems, getting good interest and, marketing of those compared with, one that has a nice stem on it. So just I think sometimes people don't realize that connection between those stems and the powdery mildew. So
my question, talking about, we talked earlier about how the cucurbita max of the winter squash types and the edible types tend to attract more insects, whether they be cucumber beetles or squash bugs. From an organic perspective, what do we have many options for insect control, or is it more about promoting healthy soils and encouraging natural predators?
So we do have some products. I would have to refer to the spray guide to tell you exactly which ones we have. I think on the organic products, I will say, I think cucumber beetles, there are a few options. I think it's squash bugs where I think the options, if I remember right, are fairly limited. Squash bugs are tough to control, even with the current product, with some of our synthetic products. Yeah. So I don't know, Grant, you may have a little insight into that just from maybe some of your production experience, but I think there are some things out there we could use, but they're definitely limited, more limited.
Yeah, it'd be a pretty limited approach. I mean, I think to your point about especially like squash bugs, when we think about where the insects are being laid, where they're hiding around some of the leaves and the foliage, they can be extremely difficult to control, and having more cultural practices, if possible, would be the route to go. But it would just be one that if you were thinking about organic production, you would just have to face the fact that you've got some really tough insects to control with the pumpkins.
Yeah, and you can, one of those things that sometimes you can tolerate them, or you can, you know, just kind of you know, coexist and get at least somewhat of a crop. You may lose some, but hopefully, you know, they get some and you get some, and you're both at least somewhat satisfied. But certainly there's some issues. We had mentioned, I think in the presentation, we had issues with melon worms, and that is one that could really, if it comes in, it's a pest that blows in, but it could really, you know, wipe you out if you didn't have, you know, something to, you know, to manage it, just because they'll come in and they'll disfigure the fruit, you know, the surface of the fruit, and just enough that they don't look nice. And that's, you know, unlike some things that maybe would have some market, you know, pumpkins are majority really about looking nice, because that's kind of their ornamental is the majority, even though we have edible purposes, you know, the majority of what's sold is not, you know, directly for consuming. It's still, you know, it's decoration. So yeah, just lots of considerations. I think it can be done, but, you know, you just have to be honest with yourself and those pests, and, you know, what you can and can't expect. And the other thing, rotate. Try to don't go back in the same area. If you're in an organic system, you just have to rotate, and the further the better. I know that that's easier said than done in some cases, but certainly rotation is your friend, because a lot of those things can overwinter. And if you're pumpkins on pumpkins in the same ground, those pests can build up to just kind of astronomical levels. If you can rotate around, you can at least, maybe you're just delaying them enough that pumpkin, even the pumpkin has a couple more weeks without, you know, heavy insect pressure, that can be enough to get that crop, you know, to a point where that insect pressure doesn't really cause as big of issues. So.
And, you know, you're talking about looking nice and things, which kind of leads me to thinking about marketing them. You know, it's all about presentation and things. Do you have any, like, maybe some tips about that, or how you would approach that, or even finding, you know, markets?
On the marketing side, I think laying your display out just in some way that you can accurately kind of show the depth of varieties and things that you have. If you have anyone on your farm crew that is kind of crafty with how they lay things out, you know, a few straw bales and a few pumpkins, maybe put them on top of each other, and you can do some kind of miraculous things just with that. But trying to think about that when you're marketing. I mean, there's obviously, you know, little nuances and details, but finding someone that can help in those capacities, and trying to don't just put the pumpkins out there, but try to lay them out somewhat in a way that sparks people's idea of how to use them. People will see them, and that alone, you know, a variety of pumpkins will promote ideas. But the stacks is a huge thing. You know, I've seen people where I'll have 3 of them stacked up, and I have someone come up and say, I want that stack. I could never have picked those out myself, but that looks really nice, and that's what I want on my front porch. So I'm like, all right, I can do that. So yeah, just some thoughts, you know, making sure that they can see, you know, obviously the different sizes, you know, trying to have things kind of oriented. So if they're looking for something specific, there's at least some kind of organization to it. At least for me, I'm kind of an organized nature, but some people go for a free for all, and you find that you'd like an Easter egg hunt, and that's fine too. So, but I don't know, that would be my thoughts. Finding markets, I think with any specialty crop, is you got to be creative, right? Right, Bronwyn? You just have to think. Yeah,
I'm not known for being creative or crafty, but when you were talking about, you know, the displays and things, it was making me wonder, because I know that you've been selling pumpkins for several years now. Do you have an idea of the percentage of jack-o'-lantern types that you sell versus the specialty? Is the market shifting in what people are looking for?
That's what I was curious about. Yeah.
I mean, you know, I used to think, you know, I've got to get I'm just going to go and find jack-o'-lanterns because the kids want to carve pumpkins. But, you know, now I look and I like, okay, you guys can each have a couple of jack-o'-lanterns, but I'm going to be buying all these other neat ones. I love the boardy ones, and, you know, the different colors, and and you know, like I'm not crafty and I can't put them together well, but I really like to look at them. So I just wondered if you're seeing any different trends in what consumers are buying.
I mean, I don't have, unfortunately, I don't have specific data to support some of that, you know, exact numbers, but I will say that the specialty pumpkins, those, the different colors and shapes and sizes, anything unique is definitely growing in popularity. Orange pumpkins have not gone away. People still want them. Some people are very traditionalist and aren't crazy about the others, but there are other people that will, you know, I think that the variety of and diversity of pumpkins is actually what's helped to promote kind of the increased popularity in pumpkin fall decorating. Because when people have, you know, 10 orange jack-o'-lantern pumpkins on their porch, no. But would they have 10 if all 10 of them are a different color and shape and size? Oh, definitely. I mean, you see it all the time. So I certainly the trend towards unique, you know, the blues, the reds, the whites, the tans, the warties, the various striped and other deviations. I mean, that's all extremely popular. And I think, to me, if I was going to market, having that diversity is what would set you apart, even you know, even from, you know, other competitors sometimes, or certainly what you can find in box stores. At least the depth, even, you know, you'll see varieties in some of those stores, but there's a lot more than what the variety of what often you can find in some of the, you know, the pre-bins of mixed bins of autumn color or whatever they have. So
That kind of brings a question up to me. We've talked, I know you talked in your webinar and things about pricing them and things like that. And would it be helpful if you're growing them to have like a few smaller, cheaper options, because you're talking about decorating, and some of the heavier specialty pumpkins, if they're sold by weight, could be quite expensive. So like giving people the option to have like one or two like feature pieces, I guess, and then you have a few smaller like gourds and things that are cheaper. Would that be like something worth thinking about?
yeah, I mean, so for me, this is just for like a local retail. Like I try to go from the smallest gourds which would be like a baby boo or Jack B. Little, which is just a little, like the mini pumpkin. Looks, you know, it's about, you know, baseball size in diameter, and, you know, easily could be, you know, I get people that'll buy one or two of those because they put on their kitchen table, and that's just makes them happy, or some gourds or something like that. But I do think that trying to include a variety, even on jack-o'-lanterns, I'll have some smaller ones that might be, you know, maybe just you know, maybe 10 pounds in size, and there'll be some that are pushing 30 pounds, and everyone has a different perspective. Certainly you get a lot of people that are, you know, budget conscious and that, but there's also an awful lot of people that shop with their eyes. At least having sat back and watched people pick out pumpkins, they're like, I want that pumpkin. And they're pretty much set that that's the pumpkin that they want. Not everyone's that way, but it's certainly, you see it more than you might think. Let's put it that way.
I think I've done that out in the field when we've been harvesting on research. I'm like, oh, I want that pumpkin. Stay away from it, Katie.
Atlantic giant? Is that what it was? You saw your Atlantic giant out there, Bronwyn?
No.
Yeah, there was some pretty big ones that she's been in.
Sometimes I have to get somebody else to put it in the truck for me. I'm strong enough to lift it up.
Even deliver it to you.
Yeah.
As a delivery person, I can say some of them were pretty heavy.
Hey, once an intern, always an intern, Katie. I mean,
it's true.
It's hard for me to not ask you to do all the other duties as assigned.
Yeah.
But no, variety is key. Yeah, that's probably the biggest kind of takeaway on some of that is, and get stuff, you know, for me, I get stuff that I like too. I mean, not everything is my favorite, but there's some, you know, that the other people like that, but I do like them to start with. So that's a part of it. But no, that's certainly where I would focus, trying to set yourself out, trying to find markets, you know, set yourself apart by what you grow. And then I also believe that's where I talk about, you know, growing quality product, you know, trying to do your best to manage fertility and pests, because that really is crucial to keeping a pumpkin that actually keeps and holds up. About $1 for every time someone asks me, it's like, oh, I'd love to get a pumpkin, but it's September and it won't keep to Halloween. And I think to myself, and it's like, you'll keep to Halloween. It's like, I still have a pumpkin. It's February and I still have a pumpkin inside my house. So yeah, there's and some people I think are in denial of that. And they're like, oh yeah, I mean, it's, to them, I'm just, I'm a pumpkin salesman, right? And then I'll get people that come back, I had that pumpkin, it's still sitting on my mantle from, last year or something on occasion. They don't all last that long, but I've had a few that will hold out. And so then they're like, these are great. They last. And, if it wasn't for the squirrels and my kids carving them, they'd keep forever. So yeah, that's where the quality product, I think that drives, once you have the market, then that drives people's interest because they know they can get something fresh and get a quality product. So if you can keep the quality vines healthy, pick those pumpkins off of nice green, healthy plants, the ideal, you shouldn't be able to, when you walk out to the pumpkin field, it shouldn't be leaves all gone to make your first harvest. You should have to hunt for those pumpkins under the leaves. It's a pain, but you're going to pull out the best pumpkins you could, quality wise, you could ask for. So,
and that thought about kind of your market, if you're selling, let's say, to consumers at a farmer's market or pick your own patch or anything like that, is there a certain week in October where you really need to get most of them sold before the price just nosedives the next week or two? I know sometimes there's a rush, but I just didn't know if you've seen kind of this is the
last few years that I've seen, you hit a peak, and it's around, you have and it varies by area. For my area, it seems like a little bit in the mid-September, like the second week of September, there's a couple people that want a few. It's usually a little too early. The third weekend of September, there's the early adopters and the hardcore people are like, we want some pumpkins now. It's pumpkin spice season in their minds. And then you get to the last weekend in October or in September and the first week in October, and it's all out, like everyone wants their pumpkins. And then that kind of lingers into that second week of October. And then after that, then it kind of starts to trickle down. So you kind of got a 2 to 3 week window where it's the most prime, and then certainly, the mid-October, it's all right. At that point, my theory, you sell a little bit, not exclusively, but more jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, people that just want carving pumpkins. Most of the people that want them like specialty pumpkins and more diverse stacks, they're the ones that are decorating early and they're really wanting to get, they've already gotten them at that point. And if you have that quality product, they're not going to come back and necessarily get a second one, unless I've had instances where people's kids and grandkids have stolen their pumpkins off their porch, not literally, but they're like, hey, I like that. Can I have that, Grandma? And so then they have to come back and replace what the kids have taken. But certainly later in October, I mean, you still get some interest. I think that's on a retail side. If you have agritourism, then I think that actually extends a little bit later better, because you get people that'll come out because they you get more interest in, oh, hey, let's take the kids and do something Halloween weekend or something. And then you'll get a few people that want some pumpkins. If you're strictly, just a retailing without the agritourism, then I think that tapers off more quickly, just because people usually have their pumpkins, and usually you get some sideline purchases just because they're already out at the farm to have fun and entertain the family and stuff on those operations. That's kind of been my perspective, and it's kind of the last few years has been kind of consistent in that pattern, that's your peak. But certainly it seems like every year you do get some people a little earlier and earlier, having interest in pumpkins. But it still seems like it's got to get to at least the middle of September before you really get very many people just truly, interested and engaged in purchases. So what about you? When do you guys go out to get your pumpkins?
Usually whenever I give them.
Whenever
you give them to us.
All right. So for those that don't get their pumpkins aren't lucky enough to get them from me. Grant, when do you go out and get your pumpkins? I know
I
the
walk to
trees.
my backyard and I get my pumpkins. So this is now my third growing season at this house. So the first season was let's see. We eat a lot of edible pumpkins. So it was candy roaster was one of our squashes, and then we also had another one that was similar kind of edible one. And then Jarradell every year. Jarradell's a wonderful pumpkin. Unfortunately, the last couple of years, squash vine borer has gotten Jarradell. So RIP, we hope that 2022 will be better. But this last summer, we took out a place where there were some older pine trees and it just brought in full sun. And so we grew the Cinderella pumpkins and started them indoors for a couple of weeks and just had massive Cinderella pumpkins. And so we had like 6 or 7 of them and they were stacked on the front porch until mid-December, maybe. That was kind of where it was at. So yeah, that's where I get my pumpkins. Is I walk out and every year I collect them all and I take a big photo of them because I don't have that many compared to truckloads like you might. But
No, that's awesome. I mean, that's great. Everyone, it's a great thing to do. Another aside, so I had some pumpkins stacked up. I don't know. I think here when everything's thawed out in January, I got rid of them before they really made a mess. But I love doing the white ones so leave them up all year. You stack up the white ones. It's like a pumpkin snowman. You just leave them up. You leave them up until they turn into a pile of mush or something. So I've had some up into. I got rid of mine for this year, but I had them into January. So
Yeah, I think it was a Cinderella that I kicked off the porch this week. Like it was still there
wow.
and still okay. And I because I have a little bit of an overhang. It was outside, but it was kind of protected, and it was finally starting to get a little bit iffy. So I rolled it off the porch and said goodbye for the year.
When I hauled I think it was probably mid-December when I hauled the pumpkins off of my porch out to the field, and my son and I like to smash them.
Yeah.
And there were a couple that I think I told Nathan this already. I was like, I don't know what you put in this pumpkin, but it's like, I mean, it was in perfect condition and I had to like find a rock to bust it with. I threw it on the ground, but it didn't break. I mean, it was like, oh wow, this is this pumpkin has got great integrity. So it wasn't as easy to smash. It was a little more challenging. So.
Well, Nathan, any parting words of wisdom? We've certainly asked you a lot of questions and shared a lot of our pumpkin experience and learned a lot from you, especially with the webinar you presented. Any parting words before we wrap up today?
No, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it. Hope 2022 for you and everyone else is a good growing season. So
I would ask Nathan, are we on Pumpkin Field Day this year? I know we do every other year.
We are on pumpkin. How silly of me not to remember my commercial advertising.
Not remember.
So, I know. So we will be having a pumpkin field day, as I mentioned in the webinar. Again, it'll be on September 1st. It is actually going to be at Eckert's Orchard in Belleville, Illinois this year. So watch the Illinois Fruit and Vegetable newsletter for all the final details. It'll be a morning program with lunch if everything goes as I want it to, and hopefully as planned. So lots of good production information. We have a couple acres that they've dedicated that I can utilize for putting out research trials like we've had before, and variety trials and other pest management and maybe some cultural cover crop management trials. So that's pretty much what will be there. I don't know how many varieties we'll have. We're just making some initial contacts with seed companies and information, but I try to keep the craziness to a minimum for the sake of my colleagues, if nothing else, but it usually ends up being in that 70 to 80 range. And I gotta, and in my defense, I really do have to pare it down. It could be a lot bigger than that if I didn't make some cuts and kind of keep it towards the new and the best that we can find. So yeah, hopefully everyone kind of marks their calendars and watch out for some of our other resources for more details.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, Nathan, for being with us today. And thanks to Bronwyn and Katie for joining us. You will find Nathan's presentation on the Illinois Extension Local Foods and Small Farms YouTube channel, or by visiting go.illinois.edu/SFWW2022 YouTube. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll hopefully be back with more of these.
All right. Thanks, guys.